When my husband Michael died at just 36 years old, I thought grief itself would be the thing that broke me, but I was wrong. What shattered me was what happened the very next day in the very house we had built our short life inside. The funeral had barely ended. People still lingered in the churchyard whispering condolences, and the scent of lilies clung to my hair as I walked up the driveway of the Bennett estate with my black dress still damp from the drizzle. I carried the framed photo of Michael pressed to my chest, as if it could shield me from what was coming. My mother-in-law Margaret was waiting at the door, her face set like stone. She did not embrace me. She did not even look at her son's picture. Instead, she opened the door wide, and before I could take a single step inside, she shoved a suitcase at my feet. "This house," she said coldly, her voice carrying more steel than sorrow, "was never yours. It was mine before you, and it is mine now. Everything my son left behind, $62 million, this estate the company shares, belongs to me. You are nothing but a temporary shadow." My knees nearly buckled. I tried to speak to remind her I was Michael's wife, that he loved me, that marriage was supposed to make me family, but she cut me down with a single sentence that will never leave me. "You were a mistake he made in his 30s, a distraction. Now that he is gone, you are gone too." She grabbed the framed photo from my arms, ripped it away, and tossed it back through the doorway. The frame shattered on the marble floor inside as the door slammed shut in my face. Rain beat down harder, soaking through the thin fabric of my dress, plastering my hair to my face. I looked down and saw the suitcase she had thrown. It was mine half-zipped clothes, spilling out one of Michael's old sweaters, clinging to the corner like a ghost of the man I had loved. Behind me, the neighbors watched from their lit windows. None came out. No one stopped her. I was humiliated and silent, standing there like a beggar in the rain. Then, as if to drive the knife deeper, Margaret pulled the curtain aside and looked down at me from the upstairs window. She lifted a crystal glass in mock salute and mouthed the words, $62 million, girl. Not a cent for you." I should have screamed. I should have begged. Instead, I bent down, picked up the suitcase with shaking hands, and stumbled down the driveway. Each step felt heavier than the last. I had not just lost my husband. I had lost the family I had tried to belong to, the home we shared, and apparently even the money Michael had worked his life for. Betrayal layered itself over grief until I could barely breathe. That night, I sat in a roadside motel, the sound of a dripping faucet echoing like a countdown clock. My phone lay dark on the table, no calls, no messages, no one checking if I had made it through the night. I replayed Margaret's words over and over, each syllable a hammer striking against the fragile glass of my heart. "You are nothing." But here is the thing about storms: sometimes they clear faster than you expect. 24 hours later, just as I was about to collapse under the weight of despair, there was a knock on that motel door. I opened it, expecting maybe a neighbor or a delivery man. Instead, there she stood, Margaret Bennett, the woman who had spit me out of her life like spoiled milk. But she looked nothing like the imperious matriarch of the night before. Her makeup had streaked, her hair had fallen limp, her coat was half-buttoned. Her hand trembled against the door frame, and her voice, the same voice that had ordered me out like trash, broke as she whispered, "Clara, please, you have to help me. They froze the accounts. They are saying only the wife can unlock them. Please, please, I am begging you." My heart slammed against my ribs. Less than a day ago, she had told me I was nothing, a mistake, a phase. And now, with $62 million slipping from her grasp, she was standing at my door, begging like a child lost in a storm. I stared at her silent as the weight of her cruelty pressed against the memory of Michael's warm smile. In that moment, one truth crystallized so sharp it almost drew blood. Family is not blood, it is not inheritance, it is not a house or an estate. Family is who stands with you in the storm, and Margaret had shown me brutally that I was not her family. I was not born into money. My childhood was shaped by modesty and hard work, raised in a quiet town where my father fixed cars in a garage behind the house, and my mother taught piano lessons to neighborhood kids. From them, I learned two things: resilience and humility. By the time I was 23, I had built a simple but meaningful life teaching second grade. My students brought me drawings with crooked hearts and stick figures, and I wore those with more pride than any jewelry. It was in the cafeteria of the university where I once volunteered for an evening adult literacy program that I first met Michael Bennett. He was 6'1", broad-shouldered but soft-spoken, a civil engineer who stayed behind after class to help an older student review math. I remember watching him adjust his glasses and lean in patiently, his kindness radiating like sunlight through a window. That night, he offered to walk me to my car, and the walk stretched into an hour of conversation about books, the city skyline, and dreams of building something that lasted longer than ourselves. He was the heir to a prominent family, but he never spoke of money. Instead, he told me about bridges he wanted to design, about children he hoped to have one day. With him, I felt seen. We dated quietly at first coffee dates between his construction site visits and my grading papers, but soon the quiet grew into something unshakable. He asked me to marry him with a ring he had inherited from his grandmother, not the kind that screamed wealth, but one that whispered history. I said yes without hesitation. What I did not anticipate was the storm waiting behind his mother's immaculate smile. Margaret Bennett had lived her entire life inside a mansion, lined with oil portraits and chandeliers, the widow of a powerful businessman and the matriarch of a dynasty built on steel and concrete. From the first handshake she gave me, I felt the chill. She studied me like I was a stain on her rug, her lips curling when she asked about my family, her eyes narrowing when I spoke about teaching. At dinner one evening, when Michael excused himself to take a call, she leaned across the table and said in a voice sweet enough to poison, "Do not mistake kindness for acceptance. You will never belong to this family." I swallowed the words like acid, but Michael returned and I said nothing. For months, I told myself she would soften, that love could bridge even the harshest divides. I was wrong. She criticized the flowers at our wedding, whispered to guests that my dress looked off the rack, refused to appear in half the photographs. On the night of our rehearsal dinner, she raised a glass and toasted to Michael's bright future. May he not be burdened by those who drag him down. Guests laughed awkwardly, and Michael's jaw clenched, but he still stood by me squeezing my hand under the table. He defended me in ways that mattered when she tried to exclude me from family business meetings, when she mocked my salary, when she suggested a prenuptial agreement that all but stripped me of rights. He told her no, and that no became the first crack in their carefully polished relationship. Despite her disdain, we built a home together. A modest 2-story house on the outskirts of the city, filled with bookshelves, the smell of baking bread, and the occasional stray cat Michael insisted on feeding. He would come home late dusk clinging to his shirt and fall asleep with engineering sketches still in his hands. I would drape a blanket over him and whisper prayers that time would grant us years. He dreamed of starting a scholarship for underprivileged kids who wanted to study engineering. He kept spreadsheets, calculations, projections, $62 million in trust funds from his late father money. Margaret guarded like a dragon, but money he quietly planned to redirect toward something meaningful. We would lie awake at night, the ceiling fan circling shadows, and he would say, "Clara, wealth is not about possession. It's about what survives us." But with every dream he shared, I knew his mother grew more suspicious. She called at odd hours, demanded he attend social functions without me, warned him that I was after his inheritance. He would laugh and shake his head, but when he hung up the phone, his shoulders would sag. Still, love held us steady. On Sundays, we would visit my parents, eat pot roast in their modest kitchen, laugh with my nieces. Those were the moments that reminded me family was more than last names and estates. It was action. It was presence. It was love. Then came the night of the accident. Michael had been working late on a highway expansion project. The call came at 2 a.m., jolting me from sleep. The police officer's voice was steady rehearsed, but it sliced me open. My husband was gone. I drove to the hospital barefoot, heart pounding, but when I arrived, they had already covered his body. His wedding band still gleamed on his hand, the same hand I had held through every storm. I kissed his forehead cold as marble and whispered goodbye. At the funeral, grief was a weight I could barely stand beneath, but Margaret stood like a queen carved from stone. Her eyes dry, her lips pressed into a line that could cut glass. When I tried to step forward to deliver a eulogy, she blocked me with a firm grip on my arm and hissed, "Not here. You will not speak." Her cruelty burned worse than the loss itself. Friends noticed eyes flicking nervously, but no one challenged her. I sat silent in the front row, nails digging crescents into my palms, listening as she painted herself the grieving widow of her son, the sole inheritor of his dreams. That day sealed everything. In Margaret's eyes, I had never been family. To her, Michael's death was not tragedy, it was opportunity. And as I stood in the drizzle outside that church, clutching the last remnants of my husband, I felt the first stirrings of a war I had never asked for, but could no longer avoid. The night Michael died was carved into me with surgical precision, a wound that never closed. It was late, nearly 2 in the morning, when the phone rang. I remember the way the sound tore through the silence of our bedroom, sharp and foreign, dragging me out of half-sleep. I reached for it, expecting him maybe saying he was working late again or that he had grabbed coffee on the way home. Instead, a steady male voice identified himself as a state trooper, and in those first clipped syllables, I felt the floor of my world give way. There had been an accident on the interstate. A truck had jackknifed in the rain. Michael's car was crushed beneath twisted steel. He had been killed instantly. I stumbled out of bed barefoot, the receiver slipping from my hand, the words echoing through the room like a curse. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and sirens in my ears, even though none were around me. When I arrived, they did not lead me to an emergency room, but to a small cold space, and there he lay, my husband, my partner, covered in a sterile white sheet. I pulled it back to see his face pale and still, his lips parted as if he might still say my name. The ring I had slid onto his finger on our wedding day still circled his hand. I pressed my lips against his forehead, already cooling, and whispered promises he would never hear. The funeral came like a storm, moving too quickly to escape. Black suits, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers, the church thick with lilies and murmurs. I wanted to stand to speak of the man who had held me through every season, who had dreamed of scholarships for children, who had made our small kitchen smell of coffee and sawdust. But when I rose, Margaret's hand clamped around my wrist with the grip of iron. Her nails dug into my skin as she leaned close and hissed through clenched teeth, "Not here. You will not steal this moment from me." I froze, heart-pounding eyes darting around as guests watched with polite confusion. She released me only when the minister began to speak, and I sank back into the pew like a reprimanded child. Margaret stepped to the podium, her black dress gleaming pearls tight around her neck. Her voice trembled just enough to seem human as she spoke of Michael as her beloved son, her legacy, her pride. Not once did she mention me. It was as if our marriage, our years together, had been erased in a single stroke of her will. The congregation murmured their assent, some nodding, others avoiding my eyes. I sat there swallowing tears, my hands clenched in my lap, nails digging crescents into my skin. Every memory of Michael surged against the cruelty of that moment, our first kiss in the rain, the night he sketched the outlines of our future foundation, the way he said my name when he was half asleep. All of it silenced by her. When the service ended, mourners filed past me with the careful pity people reserve for someone they do not know what to say to. "Be strong," they whispered. "He was a good man." I nodded numb until the line ended, and I found myself standing alone in the vestibule. Margaret swept past her arm, hooked through that of a distant cousin, chin lifted as though she were the queen of her own tragedy. Outside, the rain had not stopped. It slicked the church steps, blurred the faces of those huddled under umbrellas. I stumbled down my heels, slipping, clutching the damp program like a lifeline. The drive back to the house we had shared felt endless. When I arrived, lights were already blazing, staff moving with quiet efficiency. Margaret was there ahead of me, orchestrating as if she were managing a gala instead of a wake. She spotted me, and her eyes hardened. Without a word, she motioned to a man carrying a box. Inside, I saw fragments of my life books, clothes, framed photographs shoved together as if I were a tenant being evicted. My voice broke as I asked, "What are you doing?" Margaret's answer came like a knife, low and deliberate. "You were his wife, yes, but you are not blood. Blood is what matters. Blood is what inherits. You have no place here anymore." She turned away before I could respond, leaving me standing amid strangers carrying out the remnants of my marriage. That night, as the house filled with whispers and footsteps, I realized something devastating. I had not just lost my husband. I had lost the life we built, the family I tried to earn, the acceptance I had prayed for. In the eyes of the woman who claimed ownership of everything, I had never been more than an interloper tolerated only as long as Michael was alive. Now that he was gone, her true verdict fell harsh and final. I was invisible, irrelevant, erased. And though the world thought the tragedy was the accident on the highway for me, the deeper tragedy was this: the man who had promised forever was gone, and the woman who should have shared my grief had turned my mourning into exile. The morning after the funeral should have been a time of quiet grief, the kind where silence fills every corner and memory lingers like smoke. Instead, it was the day I lost the last fragile thread of belonging. I returned to the Bennett estate, with my black dress still hanging damp from the rain, clutching Michael's sweater against my chest. I thought perhaps there would be a moment of humanity, that Margaret might at least allow me a corner of the house to mourn. But when I reached the gates, the passcode no longer worked. I pressed the numbers again, my fingers trembling, but the keypad flashed red. Moments later, a guard emerged from the side gate, a man I had seen serving the family for years. He would not meet my eyes. He handed me a small envelope and said stiffly, "Mrs. Bennett's orders." Inside was a typed notice on letterhead declaring that I was no longer permitted on the property. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I begged, "Please, I just need to gather Michael's things. His sketches, our photographs." The guard shook his head, his lips pressed tight, and closed the gate. I stood there in disbelief until the curtains in the upstairs window shifted and I saw her. Margaret in a silk robe holding a crystal glass, even though it was barely noon. She looked down at me the way one might watch a stray dog scratching at the fence. Then, slowly, deliberately, she raised her glass in a mock toast. My stomach twisted as she mouthed words I could read even from that distance. Not a penny. Rage rose hot in my throat, but grief pressed it down. I turned away, dragging my feet down the long driveway, the weight of exile crushing every step. The humiliation deepened as neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispers curling through the hedges like smoke. They had all come to the funeral, offered their practiced condolences, and now they watched my disgrace with the same detached interest people reserve for a scandal on television. No one opened their door. No one offered me shelter. The betrayal was not just Margaret's, but the silence of an entire community that had deemed me disposable. I drove aimlessly, my hands slippery on the wheel, until I reached the motel on the edge of town. The room smelled of mildew and old cigarettes, but at least it had four walls that did not reject me. I set down my suitcase, half-zipped clothes, spilling out like intestines, and collapsed onto the bed. I thought perhaps I could at least pay for a week there, give myself time to breathe. But when I tried to use my bank card at the front desk, the machine beeped in angry denial. The clerk frowned, tried again, then shook his head. Declined. My heart slammed. I called the bank, and after what felt like hours on hold, a voice explained that the joint accounts had been frozen pending probate. In the meantime, Margaret had exclusive control as the listed matriarch of the estate. Every dollar Michael and I had shared was gone with the press of her signature. I hung up the phone and stared at the cracked ceiling, the reality pressing down like a lead weight. I had no home, no money, and the person who should have been my ally in grief had weaponized it into power. That evening, I walked to a nearby diner, thinking perhaps a hot cup of coffee might anchor me. But when I slid my card across the counter, it was declined again. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, looked at me with pity. "Happens more than you think," she whispered, pushing a cup toward me anyway. I sat there with the coffee cooling between my palms, humiliation burning through me. I could hear voices in the booth behind me, neighbors who had been at the funeral. One of them said, "Did you hear Margaret kicked her out? Can't say I'm surprised. Those girls only marry in for the money." My hands tightened on the mug until I feared it might shatter. I wanted to turn around to scream that they were wrong, that love had been real, that Michael and I had built dreams out of more than money. But I swallowed the words and let them poison me silently. Later that night, I returned to the motel room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rain streaking the window. The phone lay silent on the nightstand. No one called to check on me. Even my own family lived hours away and did not yet know the full depth of what had happened. Alone in that room, the betrayal crystallized into something sharper than grief. Margaret had not just taken money, she had taken dignity belonging the right to mourn my husband in peace. She had stripped me bare in front of a watching world and left me to bleed invisibly. And yet, as the hours ticked past and the night pressed heavy against the glass, a strange calm settled over me. If she believed I was nothing, then she had underestimated me. I still had my voice, my memories, and the truth Michael had left behind. Somewhere in his papers, somewhere in his careful planning, there had to be something more than the cruelty she wielded. But for now, all I had was a suitcase, a motel room, and a body trembling with loss. I pulled Michael's sweater from the pile of clothes, pressed it to my face, and whispered, "I will not let her erase me." It was a vow forged in the ashes of humiliation, and though I did not yet know how I understood this, grief had made me vulnerable, but betrayal had made me dangerous. The motel room had become a coffin for my spirit, its dim lamp casting long shadows that whispered of defeat, but something inside me refused to lie still. On the third morning, I pulled on Michael's sweater threadbare at the cuffs and walked into the city with the last bit of resolve I possessed. I searched for answers, not in the comfort of friends, most had retreated into silence, but in the yellowed pages of Michael's briefcase, the one item Margaret had not managed to confiscate because it had been locked in the trunk of my car. Inside were sketches of bridges, handwritten notes, and at the very bottom a worn envelope marked Estate Council. My breath caught. It contained the business card of Rachel Lee, an attorney whose name Michael had once mentioned in passing when we talked about preparing for the future. I dialed the number with trembling fingers. Her assistant answered, and by some mercy, she agreed to see me that very afternoon. Rachel's office was tucked into a row of brownstones, warm light spilling onto the polished wood floors. She was in her early 40s, sharp eyes softened by compassion, her presence steady in a way that made me want to collapse into tears. Instead, I handed her the envelope. She read silently, her brow tightening, then looked up at me with a mixture of sympathy and steel. "Clara," she said gently, "if Michael retained me, it means he trusted me with more than his designs. Tell me everything." I poured it out: the funeral, the eviction, the locked accounts, the humiliation. Her pen scratched across the notepad, her expression hardening. "You are not powerless," she said when I finished. "If Michael updated his estate plan, and I suspect he did, you have rights Margaret cannot erase with intimidation." My heart thudded painfully. "But she controls everything. The house, the money, even the bank. I have nothing." Rachel leaned forward. "Control is not the same as ownership. We need evidence. And to get it, we may need someone willing to dig where Margaret has buried the truth." That was when she introduced me to Tom Harris. He arrived the next morning, a man in his 50s with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too many lies. A private investigator, once a police detective, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood the dark corners of power. He shook my hand firmly. "I hear you've got a mother-in-law with claws," he said dryly. For the first time in days, I almost smiled. Tom explained his methods: discreet surveillance, document retrieval, interviews with staff who might know more than they dared admit. "People like Margaret always leave trails," he said. "It's just a matter of finding the thread to pull," Rachel added. "And once we have that, Clara, we'll bring it into the light where the law can do its work." Their confidence steadied me, though. Doubt still gnawed at the edges. Could I really stand against a woman who had entire banks and communities bending to her will? That night, as I lay in the motel, listening to the hum of traffic outside, I felt Michael's presence in the pages of his notes, his meticulous handwriting, his dream of using wealth not for power, but for good. It gave me strength. Over the next days, Tom worked quietly but relentlessly. He interviewed the staff who had packed my belongings, reviewed security footage, tracked financial transfers. Each evening, he would call Rachel and me, his gravelly voice delivering small fragments of the bigger picture. There were inconsistencies in the signatures on some documents, whispers from employees about Margaret pressuring Michael to sign over powers of attorney, and a particularly telling piece, a draft of a will found on her desk, dated months before Michael's death, naming her sole beneficiary, though it had never been properly notarized. Rachel's eyes gleamed when she saw copies of those papers. "That's coercion at best, fraud at worst," she said. "But what we need is the updated document Michael mentioned to me last year. He told me he was revising his estate plan to ensure his wishes were honored. If we can find that Margaret's empire crumbles." Hearing those words was like tasting air after drowning. For the first time since the funeral, hope threaded through my veins. Margaret had thrown me out believing she held all the cards, but if Michael had truly left behind a safeguard, then her cruelty would become her undoing. Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes steady on me. "It will take time, Clara. She's smart and she hides her tracks. But remember, this grief makes people careless. She thinks she has already won. That's when mistakes happen." I nodded, clutching Michael's sweater tighter. "Then we'll wait," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "We'll wait and we'll watch, and when the time comes, we'll show her what family really means." Less than 24 hours after Margaret had thrown me out into the rain with nothing but a suitcase and a heart full of grief, I saw her face plastered across the morning news. I had gone down to the motel lobby for stale coffee, the kind that tastes more like cardboard than comfort, when the television mounted above the counter flickered to a local station. There she was, Margaret Bennett, draped in a black dress with pearls around her neck, standing at a podium in the grand hall of the estate. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted forward. She spoke with the poise of a monarch, her voice rich with authority as she announced that she was now the sole steward of the Bennett fortune. $62 million, she declared, would continue to expand the family empire. She described herself as the grieving mother left to carry her son's legacy, a woman burdened with responsibility yet dignified in sorrow. Reporters scribbled, nodding, hanging on every word. She looked every bit the tragic matriarch, and I sat in the motel lobby with my paper cup, my stomach churning. To the world, she wore sorrow like a crown. To me, she had been a butcher, slicing me out of the story as though I had never existed. I turned away, unable to watch, but fate has a way of balancing scales when pride overreaches. By noon that very day, while Margaret was still basking in the glow of cameras, cracks began to form in her empire. It started with a call from the bank, one she could not ignore. Tom told me later that a suspicious transfer flagged by the estate accountants triggered an automatic freeze on the accounts. Tens of millions locked down in an instant. Margaret had expected to sweep it all into her personal holdings, but Michael's estate was not so simple. Without my authorization as his wife, the financial institutions refused to release funds. Her fury, Tom said, was volcanic. She stormed into boardrooms demanding compliance, her heels striking like gunshots, but compliance never came. By evening, whispers began circling the social elite who had once flocked to her parties. Invitations she had extended for a celebratory dinner were suddenly declined. Friends she had known for decades stopped returning her calls. At the country club where she held court like a queen, members avoided her gaze, conversations dying when she walked past. They had all heard the rumors that she had cut her daughter-in-law out without mercy, that questions lingered about the legitimacy of her claim. Appearances mattered in their world, and Margaret's appearance was beginning to sour. I did not know the full extent until the knock came at my motel door that night. I had been sitting on the bed with Michael's sweater balled in my lap, the television casting pale light across the room, when the sound rattled the frame. My first thought was Tom or Rachel, perhaps, with news. But when I opened the door, the sight nearly robbed me of breath. Margaret stood there, her immaculate veneer fractured. Her makeup had streaked down her cheeks as though she had been crying or drinking or both. Her hair, usually styled into a perfect silver wave, hung limp against her face. Her coat was buttoned wrong askew, and her hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe. For a moment, she simply stared at me, her lips parting and closing like a fish gasping for air. Then, in a voice that was nothing like the steel that had cut me days before, she whispered, "Clara, please, you must help me." I stood frozen, gripping the edge of the door, unsure if I was awake or trapped in some cruel dream. "Help you," I finally said, the words tasting bitter. Her eyes darted desperate. "They have frozen the accounts. They are saying only you, as his wife, can unlock them. Without your signature, I cannot move a cent. Everything is collapsing, Clara." The business contracts, please. I am begging you." She took a stumbling step forward, her hand reaching toward me, but I stepped back, forcing distance between us. The audacity of it left me stunned. 24 hours earlier, she had spat me out of her life like spoiled milk, left me standing in the rain, humiliated and erased. Now she stood on the threshold of my shabby motel room, stripped of dignity, begging like a pauper. Rage surged hot in my chest, colliding with the grief that had hollowed me. I wanted to scream, to throw every insult she had ever given me back in her face. But something held me still. Maybe it was Michael's voice echoing in memory, urging patience. Maybe it was the knowledge that power often collapses under its own weight if you let it. I simply asked, "Why should I help you?" She flinched, as though the question itself was crueler than exile. Because she stammered, "You loved him. We both loved him. You must care what happens to his legacy." Her words twisted like barbed wire, but behind them I saw not conviction, but desperation. She was cornered, and for the first time, she needed me. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch until her eyes flickered away. In that silence, I realized something profound. I did not need to raise my voice or hurl insults. My power lay in restraint, in forcing her to sit with her own humiliation. Finally, I stepped aside just enough to make her believe I might consider. "Tomorrow," I said coldly. "We will see tomorrow." Her mouth opened, but no sound came. She turned and walked away. Shoulders slumped, her steps uneven on the cracked pavement of the motel lot. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart racing. The woman who had told me I was nothing had come to me begging for salvation. And in that moment, I understood the beginning of justice. It does not always come with thunder. Sometimes it comes with a knock on a motel door, delivered by the very person who once tried to erase you. The next morning, the air felt heavier than usual, as if even the sky understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Rachel had arranged a formal meeting at her office, a space lined with mahogany shelves and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in a pale wash of winter light. When I walked in, my heart pounded so violently I thought the sound would echo against the walls. At the long conference table sat Rachel, calm and composed, and beside her, Tom Harris, flipping through a folder thick with documents he had collected. At the far end, Margaret arrived in a swirl of perfume and tension, her silk scarf knotted too tightly around her neck, her lips painted a defiant red. She carried herself like a queen marching into enemy territory, but I noticed the fine tremor in her hand as she placed her leather handbag on the table. For a long moment, the only sound was the tick of the antique clock on the shelf. Then Rachel began, her voice even. "We are here to address the matter of Michael Bennett's estate." Margaret cut her off with a wave of her hand. "There is no matter. My son's assets are mine. The banks have overstepped, and I expect this nonsense to end today." Rachel's eyes narrowed, but she did not raise her voice. "Mrs. Bennett, your son retained me months before his passing. He instructed me to ensure his wishes were honored no matter the pressure." Margaret stiffened her gaze, flicking toward me with disdain. "She put you up to this, didn't she? The girl with nothing, always scheming." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but Rachel pressed on. "Michael made revisions to his estate plan. Those revisions were notarized and filed, and they are binding." She opened a folder and slid a thick document across the table. The sound of the paper against wood was louder than any gavel. Margaret snatched it up, her eyes scanning greedily until the words began to register. Her face drained of color. Rachel read aloud, her voice filling the room with authority. "In the event of my passing, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to financial accounts, property, and business holdings, to my wife, Clara Bennett. My mother, Margaret Bennett, shall be provided a stipend sufficient for her basic needs, contingent upon her maintaining respectful conduct toward my wife. Should she engage in hostile behavior, intimidation, or attempts to disinherit that stipend, shall be revoked." Each word struck like a hammer. I watched Margaret's hands shake as the page fluttered. "This is outrageous!" She spat, her voice breaking. "He would never." But Rachel cut in smoothly. "It is his signature, his witness, his words. He made his choice." Margaret's gaze darted wildly around the room as if searching for a lifeline, but there was none. Tom leaned forward, his gravelly voice adding weight. We also have evidence, Mrs. Bennet, of your attempts to coerce Michael into signing earlier drafts that favored you. Those documents are invalid and, if pressed, could constitute fraud." Margaret's body jolted as if struck. She slammed the papers down and turned on me, her face twisted with rage. "You think you've won, don't you? You think my son truly wanted you a teacher from nowhere to carry his name into history?" Her voice cracked, rising to a shriek. "He was mine. His legacy is mine." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Then Rachel spoke with a finality that left no room for argument. "No, Mrs. Bennet. His legacy is Clara's, and through her it will serve the purpose he intended." Margaret opened her mouth to retort, but before sound could emerge, her knees buckled. The scarf slipped loose as her body swayed, and for one surreal moment it seemed as if time slowed. Her hand clawed at the table, knocking over a glass of water that spilled across the documents. Then she collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor with a dull thud. Gasps filled the room. The assistants who had been taking notes rushed forward. Tom bent to check her pulse. Rachel called for medical assistance. I stood frozen, my heart pounding with a mixture of shock and vindication. The woman who had declared me nothing, who had erased me at the funeral, who had mocked me from behind curtains, now lay on the ground undone by her own greed. Paramedics arrived quickly, lifting her frail form onto a stretcher. Her eyes fluttered open, briefly glassy with humiliation, and landed on me. For the first time, there was no steel in them, no superiority, only fear. I did not speak. I simply watched as she was carried out, the echo of her collapse still reverberating in the conference room. When the doors closed, Rachel exhaled slowly, adjusting her glasses. "It is finished," she said. Tom gathered the soaked papers, careful to keep the ink from smearing. "She will survive," he added, "but her empire will not." I sank into a chair, my body trembling with adrenaline. The weight of the moment pressed down on me. Relief, sorrow, victory tangled into one unbearable knot. I thought of Michael, of his dreams of scholarships and bridges, of his words whispered in the dark. Wealth is not about possession. It is about what survives us. In that instant, I understood. His legacy had not been stolen by greed. It had been protected by love, by foresight, by trust. And now it was in my hands. In the days that followed the confrontation at Rachel's office, the world I thought had ended began to take shape again, though it felt strange and fragile, like stepping onto a bridge newly built across a deep chasm. Court documents were filed, banks acknowledged the legitimacy of Michael's revised will, and for the first time since his death, I felt the ground beneath my feet steady. I walked into the main branch of the estate bank one morning, the same bank that had declined my card at the diner, and watched as the manager rose from his chair, shook my hand respectfully, and addressed me as Mrs. Bennet, primary beneficiary. The accounts, once frozen and guarded by Margaret's shadow, opened at my signature. It was not joy I felt, but an immense weight, the kind that comes when someone places a treasure in your hands and asks you not to drop it. $62 million more than I had ever imagined now flowed under my name. But instead of the greed Margaret had wielded like a weapon, all I felt was the memory of Michael's voice whispering in the night about scholarships, about bridges of opportunity. His dream became my compass. Within weeks, with Rachel's legal guidance and Tom's quiet protection, I established the Michael Bennett Foundation, dedicated to funding education for children without means and offering grants to women rebuilding after abandonment or abuse. The first board meeting was small, held in a modest community center, but as I looked around the table at teachers, social workers, and a few of Michael's former colleagues, I felt a surge of something Margaret would never understand: family built not by blood, but by action. Donations followed not from Margaret's circle of sycophants, but from ordinary people moved by Michael's story. I stood at a podium in front of a group of young students announcing scholarships in his name and saw their eyes light up with hope. In that moment, I knew his legacy was safe. Margaret, meanwhile, shrank into the very shadow she had once cast over me. The stipend outlined in the will was calculated by Rachel with surgical precision enough to keep her housed and fed, but stripped of luxury. She lost the estate, the cars, the endless flow of champagne and pearls. Word spread quickly through her circle, and those who once clung to her for invitations and favors drifted away like smoke in the wind. The country club revoked her membership. Her so-called friends whispered behind her back, mocking her fall from grace. I saw her once weeks later outside a pharmacy downtown. She wore a plain coat, her hair unstyled, her face hollowed by bitterness. She caught my eye, and for a moment her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She turned away, clutching a small paper bag to her chest, and I understood that she would never again hold the power to wound me. Justice had not arrived with handcuffs or headlines. It had arrived with quiet inevitability written in my husband's hand months before his death, carried forward by those who believed in truth. And though she still breathed, Margaret's empire had died in that conference room, leaving her with nothing but the echo of her cruelty. At night, in the small house I chose for myself, rather than the cavernous estate, I lit a candle beneath Michael's photograph and whispered updates as though he could hear. I told him about the scholarships, the children laughing in classrooms, the women rebuilding their lives with grants. I told him his dream had survived him, and though my heart still ached with the hollow of his absence, I felt him near, woven into every act of good that sprouted from the ashes of betrayal. The resolution was not revenge for the sake of pain, but justice for the sake of legacy. Margaret had tried to erase me, but in the end she erased only herself. Months have passed since that day in Rachel's office when Margaret collapsed under the weight of her own greed, and though the headlines have faded and the whispers of scandal have shifted to fresher prey, I carry the memory with me like a scar. Not one that throbs with pain anymore, but one that reminds me I survived. Life has taken on a different shape now, smaller in some ways, yet infinitely larger in meaning. I chose not to live in the Bennett estate, that mausoleum of wealth and silence. Instead, I bought a small house by the sea-white shutters, a garden that blooms wild with daisies and lavender. The ocean's rhythm steadies me, its tide a reminder that endings can also be beginnings. In the mornings, I walk along the beach, the sand cool under my bare feet, and I breathe without fear that someone will slam a door in my face. At school, I returned to teaching part-time, the laughter of children filling the hollow corners of my soul. In the afternoons, I meet with the Foundation's board reviewing scholarship applications, listening to the stories of young people who remind me of the dream Michael once carried. Each award letter we send feels like a thread mending the torn fabric of loss. Healing has not been easy. Grief still ambushes me in quiet moments, Michael's favorite song playing in a cafe, the scent of cedar reminding me of his hands working on our bookshelves. But grief has become less of a prison and more of a companion walking beside me, rather than shackling me. I no longer fight it. I let it remind me of love that was real, a love Margaret could never erase. As for her, Margaret remains a shadow on the edge of my world. She lives now in a modest apartment on the other side of town, her stipend barely stretching to cover her needs. Occasionally, she appears unannounced on the path outside the Foundation office, her eyes hollow, her voice trembling as she asks for forgiveness. Once, she even tried to step into my garden, her hand resting on the gate, whispering that she had been wrong. I looked at her, the woman who had once told me I was nothing, and I felt no rage, only distance. I told her gently, "I wish you peace, Margaret, but peace will have to be found without me." I closed the gate, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Boundaries, I have learned, are not walls of hatred, but fences of dignity. To allow her back into my life would be to reopen wounds that finally healed. Family, I know now, is not the blood that betrays you, but the people who show up when the storm hits. Rachel, with her steady counsel. Tom, with his relentless pursuit of truth. My parents, who drove hours to sit with me in the motel when I finally told them everything. My students, who still bring me crayon hearts and call me their favorite teacher. They are my family. They are proof that love is measured not in inheritance but in action. One evening, I lit a candle by Michael's photograph, the house quiet except for the sound of waves in the distance. I whispered, "We made it love. Your legacy is alive." And in that flicker of flame, I felt his presence warm and steady, as though he approved of every step. The betrayal that once nearly destroyed me has become the soil in which something stronger has grown, resilience, purpose, and a chosen family rooted in truth. If there is one lesson I carry forward, it is this. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the steady signing of documents, in the boundaries we set, in the refusal to let cruelty define us. And healing does not mean forgetting. It means remembering with strength instead of despair. Margaret thought money would make her immortal, but all it did was expose the emptiness inside her. Michael believed love could outlive him, and he was right. His name is carried now by every child whose tuition is paid, every young woman who rebuilds her life with a grant from the foundation. That is legacy. That is growth. I may walk this path without him physically, but I carry him in every choice to live with dignity. I am not erased. I am not nothing. I am proof that family is built by those who choose to stand beside you, not those who claim you by blood while driving you into the rain. When I look back now, what still astonishes me is not Margaret's cruelty, but the way life revealed the truth beneath it. Blood alone does not make family. Action does. My husband's mother used her bloodline as a weapon, but in the end, it was hollow. The people who carried me through, the lawyer who believed in justice, the investigator who chased the truth, the parents who drove hours to hold me when I had no one, those were family. Betrayal almost broke me, but boundaries rebuilt me. And with every scholarship the foundation funds, with every young person who stands a little taller because of Michael's legacy, I know love outlived loss. Justice may not come in thunder or headlines, but it does come. It comes in quiet signatures and doors we choose to close and futures we choose to build. If you're listening tonight and you have ever been made to feel like nothing, remember this: your worth is not measured by who rejects you, but by who stands with you. Dignity is not granted, it's lived one choice at a time. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone who was supposed to be family? How did you find your way back to peace? Share your story in the comments, I read them all. Tell me also where you're listening from. I love seeing the towns and cities lighting up across this community. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that justice and healing are always possible.